Welcome to the store. Don't forget to subscribe, and support me.
Eileen's hands trembled as she hoisted the last chunk of ore from the depths of the mine. The heat was suffocating, as always. Every breath felt like inhaling embers, scorching her throat, but the fire mages above demanded their ore, and they never cared how many miners died to deliver it. She wiped the sweat from her brow, leaving behind a streak of soot, and glanced at the others. Their faces were hollow, eyes blank from endless toil. There was no hope in their gazes. There hadn't been for years. Fire was power, and the mages had all of it. The earth was their furnace, and they bent the flames to their will. For centuries, the fire mages ruled over the people, using their magic to claim the fertile lands and push the rest of humanity to the barren outskirts, where life was a constant struggle for survival. The working class, the miners, laborers, and farmers, were little more than slaves, scraping by with what little the mages allowed them, but Aileen wasn't like the others. She wasn't willing to die a slow, miserable death in the mines, feeding the greed of the mages while her people starved. She had watched, listened, and learned. There had to be a way to fight back. There had to be something, anything, that could challenge the mages' control over the flames. The fire mages were not gods, after all, just men and women who had been born with magic. And men, Aileen knew, could bleed. It was during one of her shifts that the answer came to her. Deep within the mines, the air grew hotter the farther they dug, until the rocks themselves seemed to smolder. No one dared venture too close to the molten rivers of lava that bubbled beneath the surface, but Aileen was curious. She had always been curious. One evening, after the overseers had left and the other miners had retreated to their hovels, Aileen stayed behind. She took a narrow path down to the deepest part of the mine, where the heat was nearly unbearable. The air shimmered, and the walls seemed to glow with an inner fire. That was where she saw it, a chunk of ore unlike any she had ever seen. It pulsed with a faint red light, as though it was alive with the very essence of flame. Carefully, she pried it from the wall and held it in her hands. It was hot, but not burning. She turned it over, inspecting its strange, smooth surface. It felt different from any other metal she had mined before. It was light, almost hollow, yet it thrummed with a quiet power that she could feel in her bones. Aileen knew she had found something important. Something the mages didn't know about. And she had no intention of telling them. For the next several nights, Aileen smuggled pieces of the strange ore out of the mine. She worked in secret, fashioning tools and weapons in the dead of night, long after the fires had died down and the other miners were asleep. She hammered and shaped the metal, learning its properties, testing its limits. The ore was resilient, but malleable when exposed to intense heat. And when it was forged correctly, it had a curious effect on fire. Flames bent around it, obeying its commands as though the metal itself could speak to them. It wasn't long before she had created her first weapon, a sword, sleek and deadly, forged entirely from the strange ore. When she held it, she could feel the fire within her respond, as though the sword was an extension of her will. She took it outside, far from the village, and tested it against the small campfires that the miners used for warmth. With a flick of her wrist, the flames leapt to her command, twisting and swirling around the blade. She was no mage, but for the first time in her life, Aileen felt what it was like to wield fire. It wasn't magic, not exactly. The power came from the metal itself, and from the way she had forged it. But it was enough. Enough to make her dangerous. Enough to make her a threat. Aileen knew she couldn't keep this secret for long. She needed help, needed others to join her if she was going to stand a chance against the mages. So, she began recruiting, starting with the miners she trusted the most. Men and women who had lost everything, who had nothing left to lose. Slowly, she gathered a small group of rebels, showing them the power of the weapons she had created. Their skepticism turned to awe as they saw the flames bend to her will, and soon they were ready to follow her. They trained in secret, honing their skills with the flame steel weapons Aileen forged. Each night, they grew stronger, more confident. They were no longer just miners. They were warriors, ready to fight for their freedom. The first strike came when the mages sent their soldiers to the mines to collect their monthly tribute of ore. Aileen and her rebels were waiting. The soldiers, clad in their polished armor, sneered at the miners as they approached. They were used to fear and submission, to men and women bowing before their power. But this time, the miners didn't bow. This time, they stood tall, weapons in hand. The battle was swift and brutal. The soldiers, armed with steel and magic, underestimated the power of the flame steel. Aileen's sword cut through their ranks like a blade through water, and the fire they tried to summon turned against them, wrapping around them like a noose. The rebels moved as one, striking with precision and fury, and within minutes, the soldiers lay dead at their feet. It was the first victory in what would become a long and bloody war. Word of the rebellion spread quickly. More miners joined the cause, and soon, it wasn't just miners. Farmers, laborers, even a few defectors from the mage's army, all of them flocked to Aileen's banner. The people had lived under the mage's rule for so long, they had forgotten what it meant to hope. But now, they had hope. They had fire. And they had Aileen. The mages, of course, were not blind to what was happening. At first, they dismissed the rumors of rebellion as nothing more than peasant unrest. They had heard it all before, angry workers grumbling about their lot in life, only to be crushed under the weight of the mage's power. But as the weeks passed and more of their outposts fell to Aileen's forces, they realized that this was something different. The fire mages convened in their grand council chamber, a towering structure made entirely of obsidian and flame. The air crackled with energy as the most powerful mages in the land gathered to discuss the rebellion. At the head of the council sat Magister Varen, the oldest and most feared of the mages. His eyes blazed with a fire that never dimmed, and his voice was like molten lava, slow and deliberate, with a heat that could burn through bone. "This cannot continue," Varen said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The people must be reminded of their place." "But the rebels are using fire," one of the younger mages said, her voice trembling. "How is that possible?" "Only we control the flames." "Not anymore," Varen said, his eyes narrowing. "Someone has found a way to bend fire without magic. And they must be stopped." The council murmured in agreement, but Varen silenced them with a wave of his hand. "We will send our best. They will crush this rebellion before it spreads any further." Aileen stood at the edge of the camp, her hands gripping the hilt of her flame steel sword, watching the horizon. Smoke from the smoldering remains of the last battle still lingered in the air, twisting in the wind like ghosts of the fallen soldiers. They had won another fight, but each victory brought more blood, and the weight of it was starting to show in her people's eyes. They were tired, no one could deny that. The fire burned within them, but there was only so much a person could take before they were consumed by the very flames they fought with. Behind her, the camp buzzed with quiet activity. The wounded were being tended to, while others sharpened their weapons or mended their armor. They had grown into a real army now, not just a ragtag group of miners and farmers. The people had learned to fight, and they had learned to win. But every victory only seemed to tighten the noose around their necks. Aileen knew the mages were planning something. They wouldn't sit idly by while their empire crumbled, and she could feel the storm coming. she had seen the reports, small scouting parties sent to observe their movements, always disappearing before they could be caught. Rumors had spread about the mages sending their elites, the ones who could summon flames hotter than the sun and burn entire villages to the ground with a flick of their fingers. Aileen didn't believe in fear, but she was no fool. They had to be ready. Aileen, a voice called from behind. She turned to see Thorin, one of the original miners who had joined her rebellion in the early days. He was older now, lines etched deep into his face, but his eyes were still sharp. "The council's ready for you." She nodded and followed him toward the center of the camp, where a group of her closest advisors had gathered around a crude wooden table. They were a mix of former miners, soldiers who had defected from the mage's army, and the occasional mage who had turned against the regime. It wasn't an easy alliance, but they shared a common goal: freedom. "We've got a problem," Thorin said, wasting no time. He motioned to the map spread out before them, the edges of the parchment curling from the heat of the nearby campfires. "Our scout spotted movement to the west, near the old river pass. It's them. The elites." A murmur rippled through the group, tension rising like steam in the air. Everyone had heard the stories about the elites, the mage's most powerful warriors, trained in fire magic from birth, with abilities that far surpassed the standard soldiers they had faced up until now. "How many?" Aileen asked, her voice calm despite the knot forming in her chest. "Too many," Thorin said, shaking his head. "If they come at us full force, we won't be able to hold them off. We've got the numbers, but they've got the fire." Silence fell over the table as the weight of his words sank in. This wasn't like the battles they had fought before. The elites weren't just soldiers, they were living weapons, capable of wiping out entire battalions with a wave of their hand. Aileen stared at the map, her mind racing. The flame steel weapons had given them an edge, but against the elites, she wasn't sure it would be enough. They had to think of something, some way to turn the tide in their favor. She couldn't let all they had fought for be undone in a single battle. "Then we make our move first," Aileen said finally, her voice steady. She looked up at her advisors, her eyes hard. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We take the fight to them, on our terms." Thorin raised an eyebrow. "You want to attack the elites? Head on?" "No," Aileen said, shaking her head. "Not head on. We use the terrain. The river pass is narrow, too narrow for them to use their full strength. If we can lure them into the pass, we can trap them. They'll have no room to maneuver, and their fire magic won't be as effective in such tight quarters." "And how do you propose we get them into the pass?" one of the defected soldiers asked. "They're not stupid. They'll see a trap coming from a mile away." Aileen smiled, a glint of steel in her eyes. "We make them think they've already won." The night before the battle, the camp was eerily quiet. Aileen stood by the riverbank, watching the water flow under the pale moonlight. The plan was risky, there was no denying that. But it was the only chance they had. If the elites made it through the pass with their full strength intact, the rebellion would be crushed. This was their moment, their chance to turn the tide. The elites would be expecting a direct fight. They would expect the rebels to try and hold their ground, to meet them head-on in a desperate attempt to survive. But that wasn't Eileen's plan. She wasn't looking for survival. She was looking for victory. "Are you ready for this?" Thorin's voice cut through the quiet, and Aileen turned to see him approaching, his weathered face lit by the soft glow of the campfires behind him. "As ready as I'll ever be," Aileen said, her voice steady, though the weight of what was to come pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had led these people from the darkness of the mines, had shown them that they could fight back. But now, as the final battle loomed, the stakes had never felt higher. "You've brought us this far," Thorin said, his voice low. "No matter what happens tomorrow, know that you've already won more than anyone thought possible." Aline smiled faintly. "It's not enough." "Not yet." Thorin nodded, understanding. There could be no half measures, no retreat. This fight would decide everything. The first light of dawn was barely visible when the elites arrived. Aline and her forces had already positioned themselves, hidden in the rocks and cliffs that surrounded the narrow pass. The plan was simple: lure the elites into the tightest part of the pass, then collapse the cliffs on them, trapping them inside. The flame steel would do the rest, cutting through the elite warriors before they could unleash their full power. Aline crouched low, watching from her vantage point as the first of the elites came into view. They moved with an eerie grace, their armor shimmering with the heat of their magic. There were fewer than she had feared, but even a small number of elites could be deadly. She gave the signal, and one of the rebel soldiers stepped out from behind the rocks, deliberately exposing himself. The elites spotted him immediately and charged, their fire roaring to life as they prepared to burn him where he stood. But the soldier didn't run. He turned and fled into the pass, just as they had planned. The elites followed, their arrogance blinding them to the trap they were walking into. One by one, they entered the narrowest part of the pass, their flames flickering in the confined space. That's when Aline gave the second signal. The cliffs above groaned as the rebels triggered the explosions, sending tons of rock crashing down, blocking the elites' retreat. Trapped, the mages tried to unleash their magic, but the tight quarters limited their movements, and their flames sputtered against the walls of rock. Aline leapt from her hiding spot, her flame steel sword blazing in her hand. She charged into the fray, her rebels close behind her. The battle was fierce, the air filled with the clash of steel and the roar of fire, but the mages were at a disadvantage. For the first time, they were not the ones with the upper hand. The flame steel cut through their defenses, neutralizing their fire magic and turning their greatest weapon against them. Aline fought with everything she had, her blade moving in a blur of fire and steel. She could feel the heat of the mage's magic, but it didn't burn her. Not anymore. She had become something more than a miner, more than a rebel. She was fire itself, a force of nature, unstoppable. The elites fought back with desperate fury, but one by one, they fell. Aline's forces were relentless, pressing the attack, giving the mages no room to regroup. The battle was over in minutes, though it felt like hours. When the dust finally settled, Aline stood in the center of the pass, her sword still glowing with heat, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen elites. That it was over. When the sun rose fully over the mountains, Aline stood at the edge of the pass, looking down at the battlefield. They had won. The mages' most powerful warriors were defeated, and with them, the mages' hold over the people had been shattered. But as Aline looked out over the bodies, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. Not really. They had won the battle, but the war for true freedom was just beginning. There would be no going back to the way things were. The people had seen what was possible, had tasted the fire of rebellion, and they would never bow to the mages again. But freedom came with a cost, and Aline knew that the hardest battles were yet to come. She sheathed her sword and turned to face her people, who had gathered behind her, waiting for her next command. They looked to her now, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of their future. "Today, we fought for our freedom," Aline said, her voice ringing out across the pass. "But the fight isn't over. We will build a new world, one where no one lives in fear. A world where the fire belongs to all of us." The rebels cheered, their voices echoing through the mountains, but Eileen's gaze remained on the horizon. The revolution had begun with fire and steel, and it would not end until the flames of oppression had been extinguished for good.